I think another thing that makes the prequels so much different than the original trilogy. So with the
Hmm.
original trilogy, it's very basic world building. You have an empire and you have a rebellion. And honestly, you don't really see much of the rebellion because, like, Andor and Rogue One do a really good job of showing the complexities and the inner workings of the rebellion and how it's not as united and idealistic as like 4, 5, and 6 make it out to be. Because 4,
Hmm.
5, and 6 is a very mature version of the rebellion. They're established. They know what they want. The leadership is very well established, and so like there's not too much building going into it. Same with the Empire. You have an
Hmm.
established imperial force that's just dominating everything in its path, and all you have to do is focus on the characters because the
Hmm.
world's been established. It's very basic, especially considering the fact that this came 4, 5, and 6 came out during a time when this type of like idea of like an empire or like the Soviet Union, it's already been established. And so like it's a very basic idea for anyone
Hmm.
watching it too. Whereas 1, 2, and
Yeah.
3 have the whole world to build on top of establishing characters because you
Mm.
have like the first movie you have a republic. And I think what's unfortunate is a lot of the power dynamics that go into play. Like if you watch 1, 2, and 3 as the story of
Hmm.
Sheev Palpatine instead of Anakin, there's actually a lot of power dynamics that go into it. And 2 is actually an essential stepping stone for how Palpatine comes
Right.
to power.
Right.
And there's so much that goes into that that has to be established as well. And these are even scenes that like when if you watch like director's cuts and like interviews with the people who made the movie and like the screenwriting, they heavily debated like certain scenes and they had to pick and choose because there were certain scenes that just didn't focus on Anakin but were
Right.
necessary to explaining how Palpatine got to power. And so they had to put them in there to make the story overall make sense and so that they could get to 4 because that's where 1, 2, and 3 were going. They
Right.
had to end in a
Exactly.
place where 4 was possible to happen. But in order to do that, there were essential things that had to happen with Palpatine. And
Right.
so I mean, it works out that Anakin ends up being in a lot of scenes with Palpatine, but like there are other scenes where you have like Palpatine in the like on the Senate floor, and there's no
Right.
Anakin, there's no Obi-Wan, there's no Padme. I mean, you might have Yoda and Mace Windu,
Hmm.
and or Jar Jar Binks, which unfortunately he did play a role in this movie, but you
A pretty significant role
know,
too.
true. Um, but like there's so much that goes on there that you have to unpack that you didn't have to unpack with 4, 5, and 6. And so I think that that one element is what shifts so much of the quality of these movies when you're trying to fit that much in the same amount of time that you had for 4,
Hmm.
5, and 6.
Right. Just and by saying that, you're meaning there's these under there's a subtext here in this movie that pulls maybe what's the word I'm looking for? It's not like there isn't subtexts in 4, 5, and 6, but those more closely align with the arc that exists within that storyline versus these ones.
Exactly.
um he's trying to still tell the story of Anakin Skywalker, right? And
Yeah.
his rise and fall, but at the same time there are other things going on that are necessary to fully developing this arc that aren't directly related to
Yeah.
Anakin. And you can
And
maybe debate to the necessity of, let's just say, uh, Dooku and the Separatists and Obi-Wan's involvement, right? But
yeah.
the some of those other scenes that are less prevalent but still very necessary are, like you're saying, with Palpatine on the Senate floor and granting emergency powers through a Gungan to that man and stuff like that.
Yeah. In terms of this, it goes back to why I said episode 1 would be better if it didn't exist because
Mhm.
you have so much that has to be put in order to make this world make sense. But when you spend
Mhm.
an entire movie focusing on stuff that does not get us to where we need to be at the end of 3, you make it
Mhm.
even
Right.
harder to incorporate all of that, and now you just have 2 movies instead of 3. And so I think like it's
Mhm.
difficult, but it's definitely doable. And it's not like there's no world building in 4, 5, or 6. There's still world building. It's just
Mhm.
not as much, and you don't need as much because it's a much more basic world that you are constructing for the audience.
Uh-huh.
Whereas there's a couple problems that they had with 1, 2, and 3. First, you have to build a specific world. So there is a
Hmm.
requirement to get where you need to be with 4. And it's not just the
Hmm.
world, you also have to progress the character of Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, these characters that we know and love from 4, 5, and 6, and who we've seen the end of their arc, but now we need the beginning of their arc. And so it makes it difficult when you're
Right.
going out of order, but you need to have them in there and you need to incorporate them. I mean, you also have R2D2 and C3PO, but they're not major players in a way that like
Sure.
you
Sure.
need character building. They're droids.
Right.
Um,
Well, so
and so
just no. Go ahead. Sorry. Finish your thought.
uh, so that's the first problem. The second problem is one just spent so much time going nowhere. You
You mean in this one or in the first one?
the first movie, episode 1, it went nowhere. And I mean, I think I'd be feel pretty confident saying this. The one thing that I can think of, and I thought about this during the podcast we did for 1 2, that 1 did that we needed was it established how Palpatine became Chancellor. But we didn't
Right.
need that. Like honestly,
Right.
we didn't need to know how he got to be Chancellor. We could have just said he is Chancellor.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like that whole thing with him like manipulating and the Trade Federation and getting them to go
Hmm.
there and then having a vote of no confidence for Chancellor Valorum, like all of that is interesting, but it's not necessary. And it doesn't really
Hmm.
add to the deviousness or the manipulation of Palpatine because we get plenty of that in 2 and 3. And
Hmm.
so, like, I mean, the biggest show of that is when Palpatine takes emergency powers in this movie.
Right.
And like you see that with his interactions with Anakin. And so I think just the the 3 major ones is that they're building a lot bigger world than 4, 5, and 6. 2, they are having to build a very specific world and they have very specific things they need to accomplish, but they also want to do other things outside of that. And so there's like a quota they have to fill on top of the things they want to add. And then finally,
Hmm.
the fact that 1 just didn't do any of that.
Well, yeah, and here's the other thing too is that with that stuff with Palpatine, right? You have so much time dedicated to that in both of these movies, and Palpatine is not someone you're emotionally attached to in any way, either negatively or positively at this point in the movies. Like
Yeah.
he's not. You don't really get the sense like, oh, he's this guy we really want to become chancellor or to gain power in the Senate, but you also don't have a sense in which like, oh, he's a despicable man. We don't want to see him win, right? There's almost
Yeah.
a net neutral attraction to anything about this character as a character, and so the fact that they spend so much time on it is understandable because he's necessary for later in the movies, especially in 3 and onward. But um in regards to actually adding emotional value and weight to the first 2 movies, it doesn't really do that.